Happy Monday, everybody. Welcome to Timeless with Julie Hartman Live. It is Monday, December 9th, 2024. I'm Julie Hartman, and it's great, as always, to be with you. Now, we've got a lot to talk about today. Of course, we have this breaking news that Daniel Penny, the Marine veteran who fearlessly defended many civilians on the New York City subway last year, was found not guilty of criminally negligent homicide. Of course, there are many people who fall either very clearly on one side or the other side of that issue. Many who are opposing that verdict are threatening to go to the streets and riot. Not shocking, of course. Also, we have a man arrested who is a suspect in this assassination of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. And perhaps most startlingly, this past weekend, Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, that brutal dictator for the past 50 years, well, he and his father were the two brutal dictators of Syria for half a century, fell. His regime is done for. So we're going to dive into all of that. But speaking of dictators, I want to play for you a video of someone who has been falsely labeled as such. And you'll see in this clip that what he's saying doesn't exactly appear to accord with what an authoritarian would believe. Clip one.
I want to ask you, sir, one final question. What do you want to say to Americans who didn't support you in this campaign?
I'm going to treat you every bit as well as I have treated the greatest MAGA supporters. There's never been anything like MAGA in the history of this country. These people are so dedicated to making America great again. It's very simple. And I'm going to treat them just the same as I treat MAGA. We're going to treat everybody good. We want success for our country. We want safety for our country. You know, our country is under threat, as you know. We have a tremendous threat militarily because of the power of weapons and weaponry. It's a tremendous threat. Nobody talks about it, but it's a tremendous threat. I want to treat everybody the same. I want to treat them well. And at the end of this 4 years, and I have a big head start because I was there for 4 years fairly recently. A lot of bad things were done during the 4 years that I wasn't there, and mostly in what they've done in terms of our reputation overseas. Our reputation is so bad, so shot.
Well, of course, he segues into a conversation about the reputation of the United States. But boy, that first 30 seconds there, it sounds so authoritarian, right? Well, speaking of an actual authoritarian, let's look here at what is going on in Syria. Let's put up picture 6 so that we can get acquainted with the region that we are discussing. This past weekend, rebel forces led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which will be now on referred to as HTS, which is an offshoot of al-Qaeda, came from the northwest of the country, where those rebels primarily lived, and took over the capital of Damascus. This ended Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's regime. As I had mentioned, he and his father were the two dictators of Syria for the past 50 years. His father, Hafez, who, it's difficult to figure out which one was the more brutal repressor. Many believe it was his father. Many believe it was the son. Probably call it even. His father was an Air Force officer and a Ba'athist organizer who actually participated in the 1963 military coup that brought the Ba'athist Party to power. And then starting in 1971 until his death in 2000, he ruled as the brutal Alawite dictator of Syria. If you don't know what Alawite is, you are not alone. Most people don't. It is an offshoot of Shia Islam. So as we know, Islam is divided into two sects, Sunni and Shia. Sunnis comprise about 90% of Muslims. Shia comprise about 10%. The Iranian regime is notoriously the most famous and powerful Shia regime in the world, whereas most other countries are Sunni. So the Alawites are an offshoot, as I said, of the Shia part of Islam. So this past weekend, HTS came into the city of Damascus and basically, without much trouble, toppled the Assad regime. Bashar al-Assad and his wife, who, by the way, is British Syrian. She was an investment banker at JP Morgan. Bashar himself was actually a former doctor. The two of them and their 23-year-old son fled to Russia, where President Vladimir Putin is giving them asylum. Now, this isn't shocking given that Russia has propped up alongside Iran, the Assad regime over the past few decades. Namely, if we can put up that picture 6 again of the map of Syria, Russia wanted to do so in order to access some strategic naval ports there on the Mediterranean Sea. The Iranian regime backed the Assad regime, A, because they're an offshoot of Shia Islam, and B, mostly so that they could funnel weapons and other kind of aid to Hezbollah, which was, and I'm using the past tense, was the terrorist organization which operated primarily in Lebanon, but also in Syria, which was hell-bent alongside its backer Iran on toppling Israel. So we can see here in picture 4 that there are these images very similar to the United States invasion of Iraq, of Syrians toppling the many statues of Bashar al-Assad throughout Syria. We actually have a video of them, again, in a very similar, eerily similar way as we saw with the toppling of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, with people jumping with glee on top of that statue. Video 5. You get the point. Just a lot more banging with sticks at these statues. Now, President Trump has called to our attention the fact that this is particularly good for the United States because it is really a referendum on our two adversaries, Russia and Iran. As much as, of course, it's primarily a blow to the Assad regime, there's no greater blow than being toppled from your perch as dictator. It also indicates that Russia and Iran, the two backers of the Assad regime, are not in such great shape. And that is what enabled these rebel forces to go in and pretty seamlessly topple the 50-year-long regime. Russia is obviously very distracted with its war in Ukraine, and Iran is very distracted and very debilitated by its wars. And I say that with a plural there because of its support of Hamas and Hezbollah and many other proxies. Iran has been debilitated because of its wars in Israel. And so when these rebel forces came in, really the two backers, Iran and Russia, didn't have any kind of support or any kind of effectual support to lend or continue to lend to the Assad regime. Let's look at picture 2. This is what Trump tweeted on Truth Social. Assad is gone. He has fled his country. His protector, Russia, Russia, Russia. He's so funny, even in writing, led by Vladimir Putin, was not interested in protecting him any longer. There was no reason for Russia to be there in the first place. They all lost interest in Syria because of Ukraine, where close to 600,000 Russian soldiers lay wounded or dead in a war that should have never started and could go on forever. And crucially here, President Trump says, likewise, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Ukraine would like to make a deal and stop the madness. They have ridiculously lost 400,000 soldiers and many more civilians. There should be an immediate ceasefire and negotiations. The world is waiting. Now, Russia is probably very eager for President Trump to get into power for this negotiation to happen. And many have been saying that President Putin just wants an out. He gravely underestimated the power of the Ukrainian army. The war he anticipated would be over in a matter of months, and it's dragged on for years. And then now we're seeing that his allies are being destroyed, Iran and Syria. And so one can anticipate that we'll probably see a ceasefire and a negotiation, hopefully, of course, in this war in the next few months. President Trump has also counseled us, and dear God, may we pay attention to it. We are not so good at avoiding intervention in the Middle East. Let us please heed the call of President Trump to not get involved in this imploding Syrian problem. Picture 3. He put this out on X. It's interesting to me what he chooses to put on Truth Social and what he chooses to put on X. That's kind of a long analysis there. He's calling out the embarrassment, really, of President Obama, which we'll get to in just a moment. But the last part there is the most important. The United States should have nothing to do with it. This is not our fight. Let it play out. Do not get involved. Now, speaking of President Obama, really, the Syrian civil war started in response to the Arab Spring back in 2011. And that was one of the greatest displays of Bashar al-Assad's dictatorial and ruthless rule. There were other such examples over the years of the Assad family committing heinous crimes and massacres against government dissidents. There's a picture here, picture 9, dating back to the 1980s. Oh, sorry, actually, no. Picture 8, dating back to the 1980s, the Hama massacre. I believe it was in 1982, where the Assad forces unleashed a land and aerial assault, killing thousands of Syrians, namely from the Muslim Brotherhood, which was the primary group responsible for opposition to the Assad government. But going back to 2011, with the start of the Syrian civil war, there were these massive human slaughterhouses, as they were called, where the Assad regime would round up anybody who said anything negative about the regime and would torture them and murder them in huge numbers. According to one source, up to 13,000 were killed between 2011 and 2015 at one prison alone. Now we can go to picture 9, which is the Ghouta chemical attack. We remember, of course, about a decade ago when it made national headlines that the Assad regime was unleashing chemical weapons against its opponents. Of course, the Assad regime has denied this. But what is particularly important is that back between 2011 and that Ghouta chemical attack in 2013, then President Barack Obama famously said that if Bashar al-Assad would unleash chemical weapons against his own people, that would constitute, quote, a red line, where, if it were crossed, the United States would go in and back Syrian rebels against the Assad regime. In that tweet that we saw, what Donald Trump was referring to was that despite these claims that it would constitute a red line and that the United States would go to the Syrian rebels' aid, we did not, in fact, go to the Syrian rebels' aid once Bashar al-Assad unleashed those chemical weapons. So as far as what happens now, nobody really knows. In these situations, it tends to be a, pardon my French, but show for some time as different factions compete for power in this country. What does seem clear immediately, though, is that Turkey is the big winner in this case, because Turkey, as I had mentioned, backed those rebel forces, HTS, which were the offshoot of al-Qaeda. And those are Sunni militants. Turkey is a Sunni Muslim country. And we have seen that since October 7th, they have been very brazen in backing many Sunni Muslim militant forces, including, of course, Hamas. I wrote an article in the American Mind about how after October 7th, there were these chants that were roaring through the Turkish parliament saying, Allahu Akbar, down with Israel, free Palestine, free Palestine. They were waving the Palestinian flags. The president of Turkey, Erdogan, is a Muslim fundamentalist who endeavors to bring the country away from the secular Ataturk history and more towards a Sunni fundamentalist Muslim country. And they have been backing those rebels against the Alawite Shia government of the Assads, and they are appearing even now to take some territory here in Syria. What's also important to note is that the Turks, historically speaking, are no friends of the Kurds, and the Kurds have a pretty large population in Syria, which the Turkish government, it would appear, is endeavoring to put it mildly, cause trouble for. Now, also, in addition to saying that Turkey is the big victor here, we know who the two losers are, and that's Iran and Russia, and especially Iran. Because if we look at the past year, Hamas has been very severely leveled in Gaza. Recently, Israeli forces basically completely destroyed Hezbollah, killing most notably the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, as well as many other top Hezbollah officials with some of those attacks. Of course, we all remember the pager attack. And then now, the Assad regime, one of the top three, alongside Hamas and Hezbollah, allies of the Iranian regime, is nixed. And certainly with President Trump coming into power and his likelihood in stripping Iran of the cash flush that the Biden administration so graciously gave to the terrorist regime, it appears that Iran will continue to struggle, which is a victory for the West and a victory for decency all around the world. And finally, there's been this huge refugee crisis as a result of the Syrian civil war. In 2015, we know that 1 million people arrived in Europe from Syria alone. And many kind of trace that back to being the kickstart of the massive influx of Muslim immigration that we have seen so far in Europe. So it may be the case, keyword may, that this toppling of the Assad regime would allow these millions of refugees that are scattered across Europe and are in camps, refugee camps in neighboring Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey, to perhaps come back to Syria. In the meantime, the United States is conducting airstrikes in the Kurdish part of Syria, that's in the northeast, in order to get rid of some ISIS strongholds there, hopefully trying to make it such that ISIS does not take over in this power vacuum. And then according to the Wall Street Journal just minutes ago, quote, Israel said that it destroyed chemical and other weapons in Syria and seized areas along the country's shared border. So maybe it's too much to hope that this country will have a more secular, Western-oriented rule. Probably is. But again, the main thing here is a good thing, which is that Iran has been completely and totally humiliated. Moving on, away from the Syrian civil war to two stories of crime here in the United States. Daniel Penny, that Marine veteran who is hailed as a hero by some and a villain by others, was found not guilty today of criminally negligent homicide. We all remember that video last year of Daniel Penny holding Jordan Neely, who was the black homeless schizophrenic man who came onto the subway yelling that he wanted to kill people. Remember the video of Daniel Penny holding him in a chokehold. And so, of course, this was brought to trial, and it was a hung jury. They couldn't get a unanimous vote, so he was found not guilty. The main parts of this case, which worked to Daniel Penny's favor, is that, number one, the chief medical expert of the defense said that Jordan Neely did not die of the chokehold. He died because of really the synthetic marijuana and a combination of a schizophrenic physical outburst that, according, again, to the defense medical specialist. So that was a big help to Daniel Penny in this case. And also another big help was that several people who were on that subway testified that they were legitimately fearful for their lives. Jordan Neely went onto the subway that day, and he immediately threatened to kill people. He yelled, quote, "Someone is going to die today. I'll go to prison forever. I don't care." And he was walking very menacingly around the subway car. Passengers, such as one mom, barricaded her son in the corner in his stroller. And that's when Daniel Penny jumped in an effort to subdue Jordan Neely and put him in a chokehold. Now, we've been talking recently on Timeless about Mayor Eric Adams, who has seemed to come out with some, dare I say, conservative, common sense positions. Last week, we were discussing how Eric Adams said that he would support Donald Trump's campaign to deport criminal illegal immigrants. He's also come out with a kind of based take with regard to this Daniel Penny case. He said recently, quote, "We're now on the subway where we're hearing someone talking about killing people. You have someone, Penny, on that subway who was responding, doing what we should have done as a city." So that seems like Mayor Adams is siding there with Daniel Penny. Now, as I indicated a few minutes ago, Many Black Lives Matter activists and people protesting outside of that courthouse are threatening to convulse riots around the city. Now, let's hope that doesn't happen, although, of course, I don't think any of that would really shock us. And a second thing here with regard to crime in Manhattan, my gosh, a suspect has been arrested today in Pennsylvania. He is in this, he's a suspect in this case with regard to the assassination of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, who was shot dead just before 7 o'clock in the morning last week in Manhattan. Now, this individual was a University of Pennsylvania student. I texted many of my friends who went to Penn and said, did you know this guy? Forgive me, I can't find his name. I think the first name is Luigi Meggione. Thank you, Sean. So he went to the University of Pennsylvania, and he was actually arrested in Pennsylvania at a McDonald's today. He, according to ABC, had a similar gun to that used by the assassin. According to the New York Post, he also was found with a silencer and 4 fake IDs. And perhaps most damningly, according to the New York Times, he had a manifesto on him, which criticized healthcare companies. So that kind of seems like a pretty big smoking gun there. Now, this part, I'm sure many of you know, this one is an eyebrow raiser for me. Authorities said that the shell castings, this is reading here from the Daily Wire, recovered by detectives at the scene of the CEO Brian Thompson's assassination had the words delay, deny, and depose written on them. So once this goes to trial, if this individual, the suspect, is charged with the assassination of Brian Thompson, it'll be very interesting to see what he meant and if he has any kind of personal tie to United Healthcare. I would anticipate that he probably does. So boy, a lot of important news stories today. Sometimes it rains, sometimes it pours with the news. Today's definitely a pours day. Speaking of pouring, I don't know. I was trying to find a good segue. Pouring with gifts. You want to be pouring with Christmas gifts. Yeah, that's like a 1 out of 10 segue. Well, if you want to stock the Christmas tree in the next few weeks, you should consider getting your products from MyPillow. I know you've been waiting for this read. Well, here it is. With hundreds of MyPillow products, there's something for everyone on your Christmas list. From bathrobes, duvets, quilts, down comforters, and so much more. Right now, MyPillow is having a Christmas extravaganza. You can get this season's flannel sheets for as low as $59.98, and they won't last long, so get them while you can. You can also get their famous My Slippers. That's my favorite MyPillow product. These haven't been on sale for over a year. They're regularly priced at $119.98, but for a limited time, they're now for $59.98. You can also get their 6-piece towel set back in stock with extremely limited quantities for only $29.98. Flannel sheets for as low as $59.98. As I said, the 6-piece towel sets for just $29.98. And that's not all. They're extending their 60-day money-back guarantee until March 1st, 2025, and all orders $75 or more ship absolutely free. Go to MyPillow.com or call 1-800-566-6745 and use the promo code Hartman. That's the promo code Hartman. I'm learning here that we are having some technical difficulties with our stream. Not shocking. But we will post a separate full video of this episode so that it can go uninterrupted. In our final part of today, I want to continue with our 10 days of the Gospels. As I mention every episode, I was someone who, until very recently in my life, severely lacked in biblical literacy. And something that I endeavor to do in my broadcasting work is to make people more biblically literate, because it is the foundation of our civilization, not to mention something that's very deeply personally edifying. And today we're going to look at the 12 apostles. we're just profiling different parts of the Gospels, the life of Jesus, and seeing what we can glean from them. And as some of you know, this summer I traveled all around Europe. I spoke at the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation at Oxford, which, by the way, I'm going to be posting that video of my speech very soon. I also spoke at anti-communist conferences in Romania and Hungary. And I also happened to go on a Catholic spiritual immersion boot camp in Rome. And when I got there, I was someone who had no basis for faith, really, in Catholicism. I was baptized as a Catholic, but I knew very little. I would go to Mass, and they would do that cross for the readings of the apostles. And I would look around and go, what are these people doing? I had no idea what was going on. And then when they would cross themselves, I would also look and see which way you would go. Is it right to left or left to right? In other words, I had no idea what was going on. But one thing I found to be intriguing was a lot of the 20-something-year-olds in my group would ask each other, who's your favorite apostle? And I would think, can you have a favorite apostle? Like, do we even know that much about each of the apostles? And what I found out is, yes, we do know a lot about each of them. And I think there's a very cool through line through who he, Jesus, that is, decides to name as his apostles. There are 12, as we know, and the term apostles means those who are sent out. And we also know from the Gospels that although Jesus, being Jesus, could see into people's hearts and know their intentions and know their goodness, he actually called on God, the Father, for help in choosing these apostles. And there's this famous story where one night he went up into a mountain and he prayed almost all night for help and wisdom from God in discerning who should be the 12 apostles. And once he collected those 12 apostles, he gave each of them the power to cure diseases, to cast out devils, which we're going to talk about later this week, and also, most importantly and most obviously, to go out and, apropos of the name, spread the word of Christ. The first apostle, I may identify as my favorite, Peter, although maybe Paul is my favorite, but I want to focus on the two of them to start, even though, by the way, Paul isn't typically named as an apostle. If you approach St. Peter's in the Vatican, you see that on both sides of St. Peter's, there's one statue of Peter, and there's another statue of Paul. And the more that I learned about those two figures, it was a vehicle for my admiration for Christianity, because both of them were sinners. And both of them were people who, in particular, grievously betrayed Christ. When I was back in my very little literacy days of the Bible, I thought that Judas was the only one who betrayed Christ. But then I came to learn that that is absolutely not true. And it made me so appreciative, and as I said, such an admirer of Christianity, that the two people who they chose to elevate outside of St. Peter's were two people who betrayed God. And I think what that does is it gives you a place to go. Whenever I was struggling with my faith, or I felt unworthy, or I just felt kind of lost, I would look up at those two, and especially St. Paul, who persecuted Christians and then had a conversion moment. And I would feel very accepted, because I would go, okay, even if I struggle in my faith, at least I wasn't that guy. I know I haven't been persecuting Christians. And so you look at them and you go, well, if they could be elevated as apostles with all that they did, I can certainly be seen as worthy in the eyes of God. So we're not going to talk about all of the apostles because that would take a very long time. It's very difficult to choose which one to talk about. But let's pull up picture 10, of course. This is the most famous depiction of the apostles, the Last Supper of Leonardo da Vinci. Peter is one of the fishermen alongside his brother Andrew, James, and John. And he was originally named Simon. And when Jesus met Peter, he renamed him Peter, which in Greek means a stone. And he, of course, names him that because he famously says, quote, "I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." He's known, Peter, as the first pope, and every single pope that came after him was known as, the 100th successor in the line of Peter. But again here, Peter was not someone who just totally followed God and presented no challenge. He would often challenge Christ. In fact, there was one episode where Jesus said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." He referred to Peter as Satan because he was so annoyed with whatever Peter was saying to him. And then, of course, Jesus predicted that Peter would betray him. And Peter said, "No, of course I'm not going to betray you. You're the Son of God. You're the best. I would never do that." And Jesus said, "You will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows." And then when Jesus was arrested by the Roman authorities because another disciple, who we'll get to in a minute, betrayed him, Peter was asked by the Roman authorities, "Do you know this man?" And he said, "No." And the Roman authorities said again, "Do you know this man?" And he said, "No." 3rd time, "Do you know this man?" And Peter said no a 3rd time. And so here, this individual, the apostle who was elevated as the rock on which Jesus would build his church, the person who he identifies as the first pope, as holding the keys, he was someone who betrayed Christ in the hour that he was crucified. How amazing is that? I really cannot identify any other religious tradition that has a similar story. And we see that time and time again in the Judeo-Christian tradition, that the wayward or the ones that are looked over or the ones that would seem to not be elevated in the eyes of God are the ones who are elevated in the eyes of God. If you look back to Noah was a drunk. Literally, in the first few chapters of Genesis, he was a drunk, and he was the one that was deemed to be the most righteous in his generations and was saved on the boat from the flood. Moses of all people, who was tasked with revealing God's 10 commandments on Mount Sinai, he had a stutter. Isn't that so ironic that, again, the vessel of God, the person who was orally relaying the 10 commandments, himself had a stutter? And then we see here that the first pope, the stone on which the church is built, betrayed the very person who created that church. It's such a beautiful thing, I think, because again, it gives you a place to go. You never feel too far out of the reach of coming into belief and faith, because you look at these people and you can judge yourselves against them, and most of the time you'll come up in a pretty good way compared to them. But here's what makes Peter different from Judas. Peter bitterly wept once he betrayed Christ. He showed so much contrition and so much shame. He, quote, reading from the Gospels, went out and wept bitterly. And Christ saw that he was very remorseful and forgave him and continued on with him as the stone on which the church was built. That's different from Judas. When Judas betrayed Christ, he didn't weep bitterly. He sort of showed an act of contrition. He had remorse, it says in the book of Matthew. He returned the 30 coins that he was given to chief priests. But what ended up happening was that Judas just succumbed to sadness and killed himself, which a lot of people also don't know. I didn't know anything really, but I certainly didn't know that Judas killed himself. And many say that if Judas had shown the same kind of contrition as Peter did, then maybe his fate would have been different. And again, I think that is the most incredible thing, that these individuals are elevated. I'll give you 2 more examples, although I know we're not going to talk about all the apostles, but I now more and more understand why those people who I met in Rome were asking who one's favorite apostle was, because they do have, each of them have these interesting facets, and you can see yourselves in them. Andrew was the first apostle. He's the brother of Simon Peter. And again, what's cool about these different apostles is that some of them were ones who betrayed Christ. Others were doubters. We'll get to that one in a moment. Andrew, I would put into the category of kind of unremarkable, which in itself is worthy of note. That you don't need to be very rich or very handsome or very smart or very talented in order to be elevated and in the eyes of God. Andrew was Simon Peter's brother. He was a fisherman, but the reason that Jesus chose him as his first disciple was because he affirmed a faith in Christ. John the Baptist famously said in the book of John, when he was standing in front of Jesus, "Behold, this is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And Andrew had faith, and we don't learn very much of him besides the fact that he went to his brother, Simon Peter, and told him, "We found the Messiah," and brought him to Jesus. And it is because Andrew had such faith and brought others to Jesus that Jesus named him the first apostle. Again, I guess it is a remarkable thing to affirm your faith in Christ, but it's not like Jesus went around choosing, the celebrities or the rich people. It's so important to look at these different choices and see something about the faith here reflected. And the final one I'll tell you about, and this one I love because I have a personal story to tell you about, is the Apostle Thomas. Now, Thomas was the doubter. Again, at the risk of repeating myself, another amazing thing that the people who he elevated were people who doubted him and challenged him. He didn't just have these people who were blindly following him and affirming his divinity. Time and time again in the Gospels, Thomas challenges God, including at the Last Supper, when Jesus says, do not let your heart be troubled, believe in me. If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, you will be there also. And Thomas says to him, "But we don't know where you're going. How will we know where to follow you?" And so it's just those kinds of questions which made Thomas get the reputation of being an inquisitor. But then after Jesus died and was resurrected, Thomas, like many people then and now, had trouble believing that such a thing happened. And he said in the Gospel of Luke, he said, quote, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the nail marks and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." And that is another source of such strength, in particular for someone like me who has historically struggled with faith, that here we see someone who's doubting, someone who's going, "Wait a minute, hello, you're telling me this guy died and was resurrected after 3 days?" You read that, and you as a would-be follower of Christ is like, thank you for acknowledging that this is a very difficult thing to believe. Sometimes you have to see to believe. And 8 days later, Thomas did just that. He walked up to Jesus, he put his finger into his side, as he said, "I will not believe it unless I see it," and put my finger into the nail marks. He put his finger into the site of the incision of the nails on the cross. And that's when he knew that he really was resurrected after being crucified. In fact, when I was in Rome, I went to a church where they believed to have the relic of the finger of St. Thomas. And after that, I was out on a free afternoon, and I went into a coffee shop, and I met this guy behind the counter, and I sat outside, and he came and sat with me, and we were talking about why I was in Rome and how long he's lived there, et cetera, et cetera. And I learned that his name is Thomas. And I said to him, because his coffee shop is literally right next door to the Vatican, I said, "Are you a believer?" And he said, "No, I really wasn't." And I said, or he said, "No, I'm really not now. I was, but I just have all of these doubts." And I said to him, "Well, that's very much in line with your name. Your name is Thomas. It's kind of an obligation for you to have doubts." And he went, really? And I said, yes. And I told him the story of the Apostle Thomas and needing to see to believe and being the questioner. And this guy from the coffee store, Thomas, got such a sense of comfort from knowing that there was an apostle who doubted, and it was his namesake, that I kept coming back to him time and time again over the next few days that I was there. And he actually said that that was sort of a pillar on which he rebuilt his faith, knowing that there was someone else who had that kind of persistent doubt. And again, it didn't exactly hurt that this guy shared his name. And so we'll leave it at that for today. We'll show you one other, or actually two other. This is Karl Bloch's The Last Supper from the late 19th century, picture 11, which is a fantastic, beautiful painting. And then we'll show you these relief carvings of the 12 apostles at a church in Spain. I love going up to those fantastic cathedrals and seeing them. And also, when you get to know the apostles better, you can zoom in, and sometimes you'll see a sword next to Paul because he was beheaded. You'll see Peter holding the keys. Sometimes you'll see Judas with the money bag. Maybe you'll see Thomas with an outstretched finger. But each of these people are both remarkable and unremarkable. Remarkable in that they were chosen by Christ, but shared defects and deficiencies that I think could give all of us a vehicle towards faith, knowing that no matter how much we think we fall down, there's always, always a place for us to go. And think no further than St. Paul, the Christian persecutor who literally traveled around the Roman Empire, beheading and jailing and persecuting Christians. He was the persecutor in chief, and he was chosen by Jesus to be a disciple. So I said, no matter how much I fall, I know I haven't done that. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you enjoyed this. And for those of you who continue to write in about Dennis, I have seen him several times over the past few days, and he's slowly getting better. But I noticed that his spirits are very much up lately. And at the risk of repeating myself, so much of that is because of the lovely messages that you write in. So please do continue to write in to me at julie@julie-hartman.com, and I'll see you tomorrow right here on Timeless, hopefully free of any glitches at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern. Take care.